Get another one. This is going to be a good one tonight. Woo! Alright, welcome to History by Phillips. Mr. Phillips. Last time we looked at the Constitution. Two big things that we looked at. One was the 7 principles of the Constitution. If you don't remember, here's a quick recap. First, you have popular sovereignty. Pretty much it's the will of the people. People are not going to vote for somebody they don't like. Hence, our government and our representatives should be very reflective of the citizens' attitudes. Number 2, we talked about republicanism. No, I'm not referring to the Republican Party and Donald Trump. The nation as a republic. All that simply means is that we elect representatives to represent us in government. The example I use is Jeremy Faison. Jeremy Faison represents pretty much most of East Tennessee. When we have complaints, issues, whatever, Mr. Faison, he'll go to Nashville and address those for us. It's a lot easier for one person to do it than pretty much everybody from East Tennessee to go to Nashville to do it. But that's what republic form of government means. Number 3, limited government. Just because you're elected doesn't mean you can get away willy-nilly do what you want. You still have to follow the same rules and laws that us regular citizens do. Just because you're elected doesn't mean you get special privileges. Number 4, federalism. Federalism, if you don't remember, that's pretty much where the federal government works along with the state government. Each have their own responsibilities. A quick example, the federal government is responsible for like foreign relations, military matters, things of that sort, while the states are responsible for like the schools, hospitals, things of that sort. Number 5, we talked about separation of powers. Separation of powers, if you don't remember, the French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu, he said it'd be good if your government was separated instead of having one person in charge. That's alright that one person in charge is a good person, but in the example I like to use, King George. King George was violating people's natural rights, God-given rights. There was nobody really there to check him. So along with the separation of powers, that'll bring us to number 6, checks and balances. If you don't remember, our government is set up in 3 different branches. We have the executive branch, which is pretty much president and his boys, or girls these days, pretty much help him out, because remember, a president doesn't know everything. The example I use is Donald Trump. Donald Trump's a great businessman, but do you think Donald Trump is any medical knowledge? No, that'd be crazy to think he does. So he has to rely on experts like the Surgeon General, things of that sort, to help him make informed decisions. Talk about, let's see here, checks and balances. Checks and balances. Remember, each branch can stop the other one from misbehaving. If Congress starts passing laws that seem crazy, the president can veto it. If the president starts acting crazy, Congress can impeach him. They can appoint judges, or the president can appoint judges to the Supreme Court, but it has to be approved by Congress. That's going on right now. The Senate's going to have a confirmation vote on the newly selected judge by Donald Trump, Amy Barrett. See how that goes this week. But that is a perfect example of checks and balances being used. Donald Trump, he chose a judge to be on the Supreme Court, and Congress is deciding whether or not that judge is good enough or not. Politics out of it's a big mess right now. But that's how checks and balances work. And lastly, individual rights. Pretty much your rights are protected, pretty much laid out in the Constitution. Like your example, the first 10 amendments. Pretty much tells the government what they can and cannot do. Secondly, we talked about the 3 branches of government. Just real quick, you got the legislative branch. That is pretty much your Congress. Remember, Congress is made up of 2 things. First, you got the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is based on a state's population. And the second part of Congress is the Senate. Remember, every state gets 2 senators, no matter how many people they have in that state. Every state gets 2 senators. We talked about the executive branch. That is the president and his cabinet. We'll be talking about that a little bit more today. But the cabinet is pretty much experts in various fields. Once again, I'll use Donald Trump as an example. He's a businessman. He's not a medical man or a education man. He's going to rely on people who's pretty much worked in those fields all their life to help him make decisions. Then we have the judicial branch. It's pretty much the Supreme Court and all the district courts and courts below them. They pretty much decide whether things are constitutional and fair for the citizens. But that will bring us into today's lesson. Today's lesson is the first president. We'll be talking about the Federalist Era. This will be the emergence of the political parties. We'll be taking a look at what George Washington thought about political parties, whether they's a good or bad thing for the country. But let's get this underway. So in 1789, George Washington becomes president, wins by a landslide. Remember, George Washington's like, other than Ben Franklin, George Washington is America's celebrity. He fought in the French and Indian War. He was a prisoner of war for a little bit. He was named the Continental General of the Continental Army. He's from Virginia, one of the biggest, most populous state. Everybody loves George Washington. Remember, this loon led people across the frozen river during Christmas to attack Boston. Remember, Boston was one of the heavily contested areas during the American Revolution. So he won the support up there to New England colonies, plus down the south. Everybody's loving George Washington. Well, after the Continental Congress got together and established what the government should look like and how it should be ran, they held elections. Also, George Washington would win. So George Washington, he would end up taking office in 1789. Now, with that, he would have several folks appointed with him. He would name John Adams his vice president. Typically, when you're vice president, more times than not, when you run for president the next time, you'll win. George Washington will serve his terms, then John Adams will take over after him, after George Washington steps down, but we'll be talking about that tomorrow. But along with that, we see the formation of the cabinet. You start seeing the executive branch start taking hold here. He names several people to his cabinet. First, he names Thomas Jefferson to the Department of State. He is the Secretary of State. Let's see if he's up here. Right here, Thomas Jefferson. So basically, his responsibilities is conducting foreign relations. So he'll be talking to countries like Britain, France, Spain, you name it. If anything has to do with another country, this will fall on to Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. That's his responsibilities. Also, you have Alexander Hamilton. Where is he at in this picture? Right here, this bit. He's going to be very prominent in today's lesson. Alexander Hamilton, if you don't know, he's on your $10 bill. But Alexander Hamilton is going to be the head of pardon me, let me get some coffee here. But he will be the head of the Department of Treasury. Anytime you're the head of any of those departments, you become secretary. So he'll be Secretary of Treasury. Pretty much he's in charge of the nation's money. Best way to look at it. Next, you got Henry Knox. He'll be the Secretary of War, the head of the Department of War, pretty much anything that relates to military matters. Henry Knox will be in charge of that. He was a general in the American Revolution, pretty good buddies with George Washington. Smart pick, military-minded. Henry Knox. There is a fort named after him in Kentucky, Fort Knox. Very prominent. Then you got Edmund Randolph. He is the Attorney General. Best way to think of the Attorney General is he is the people's lawyer. He's there to represent the regular citizens, make sure everything seems to be fair for them. If there's going to be laws or ideas that's going to be bounced around between all these people, he's there to make sure it's going to be fair for the United States, for the U.S. citizens. But you see the establishment of the cabinet here. These people have their responsibilities, their own responsibilities, but we'll be focused on Mr. Hamilton here shortly, with the creation of the National Bank, and whether that was a good or bad thing. We'll get in that to a moment. But first, we'll talk about the Judicial Branch. So, if you don't recall, the Federalists favor a strong central government, meaning they think the government in Washington, D.C. should be stronger than the 50 state governments. So Washington, he'll pass something called the Judiciary Act of 1789. Basically, created the federal court system and outlined what the Supreme Court can do. Basically, if the states come up with laws and stuff and they find them unconstitutional, the Supreme Court can go in and override what they did. It's basically a good way to sum it up. So basically, if the state courts or the state legislatures come up with ridiculous laws and the federal government catches wind of it, they have the authorization to go in and override that. Hence, the federal government is over the state governments. This is federalism taking place here. But you'll see the judicial branch right here. They'll start getting their own teeth. They'll be coming up with something very soon, kind of a power they gave to themselves called judicial review. Be looking forward for that term. Probably 2 days from now, judicial review. But let's get into the crux of this. So, oh yeah, the Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights is also passed under George Washington. Hopefully I don't need to go over these again, but hopefully you realize the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments. Originally, they were 12 amendments proposed. Only 10 of them got approved. Once again, these 10 are the freedom of speech, religion, assembly, yada, 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 right to bear arms, so on and so forth. Can't quarter troops, can't be searched, don't have to testify against yourself, right to a trial, right to a jury, right from cruel and unusual punishment, rights not listed in the Constitution, and the states. Pretty much state rights down here. But that'll be your first 10 amendments. So let's move on to the crux of this. So, we talked about the Constitution and all these documents, yada, yada, yada. Let's get back to, well, instead of these documents, let's get back to the history of this. So, as you know, we've established wars cost money. It's Alexander Hamilton, by the way. Wars cost money, and the way you pay for those wars is typically taxing. Now, the way these folks were trying to pay off their debt at the time was each state had their own debt. So, for instance, that places like Boston, Massachusetts, where the fighting was very heavy, they had to spend a lot of money to help fight off the British. Those states will be in more debt than, let's say, the southern states like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, states like that. They didn't have that much debt compared to the New England and middle colonies. So they was able to pay off their debts pretty quick, while these northern or these New England colonies, they had to struggle for a little bit. So, to help smooth things over, Mr. Hamilton, he comes up with this idea. It's like, what if the national government would pay this debt for the states? The reason for this is that way the states will start favoring the federal government and be like, okay, this is a good thing, yada, yada, yada. So essentially you have all the debt put in one pile, and through the taxes of various states, it all get paid off. Now, the problem with this is this will make these Southerners very upset, because the South, they pretty much paid off their debt. They don't have to. Why should they have to pay for debt for Boston or for Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania? Why should they do it? But once again, we are United States. You'll help your brother and sister out. Same thing in this case. Yeah, you may have your debts paid off, but once again, the war wasn't really fought in the South as much as it was in New England. So this will make the Southerners mad. It's like, we paid our debts, why should we help them? So to help keep the Southerners calm, they would move the national capital toward the South. It was around Philadelphia. Boston has been bouncing around up in New England. But to kind of keep the Southerners happy, they would move the capital toward Washington, D.C. I don't have a map. They'd move the capital toward Washington, D.C. That's why the capital's still there today. It's pretty much a halfway mark between the North and South. They'd set it up right there between Virginia and Maryland. Something we call the District of Columbia. District of Columbia is its own entity. It's not Virginia and it's not Maryland. It is the District of Columbia. So if you're wondering what Washington, D.C. stands for, it stands for Washington District of Columbia. Once again, yada, yada. Oh yeah, bonds. We got to talk about bonds. Real quick, a bond. So when the government needs money, it'll ask its citizens, like, hey, give us some money and we'll pay you back. So let's say Mr. Phelps here, he wants to help the government out. I will give them $100. In return, they'll give me a bond. And over time, the government will pay me back with interest. So I give them $100 now, and maybe a year or two from then, they'll give me like 120 back. That's to help the government out. This has been prominent throughout U.S. history, especially in World War II. Bond drives, all sorts of things that would be helped. Pretty much the citizens of the country is lending money to the government so they can help fund things like the military, ammo, food, logistics, you name it. That's what bonds are for. Pretty much the citizens get the government money and the government's supposed to give them back. Well, they did this during the American Revolution, and a lot of these folks thought these bonds were they's never going to get paid for. So a lot of folks started selling these bonds to investors, I guess, the best way to look at it. They was like, man, the government's never going to pay this back. I'm never going to get my money. This guy's willing to buy my bond off of me for $80. I'm like, okay, I'll do that. So essentially you have people giving a $100 bill to the government. They give them a bond. They're like, man, it's been forever. These people are never going to pay our bonds. So they'll start selling them off to other people for a loss. So they'll sell them for like $80 to somebody else. Well, Alexander Hamilton is like, we got to pay these bonds back. He starts paying these bonds back with interest. He starts whoever owned these bonds, they start getting money back. Now this upset a lot of folks because a lot of folks sold their bonds for cheap to other people. We call them speculators. These speculators, they gather all these bonds and they make a bank off of it. Basically, they get rich real quick because they took advantage of people needing money, so on and so forth. It's kind of like a pawn. You can take something to the pawn shop, they'll give you money for it, yada, yada, yada. And same thing here. These people that had all these bonds, all of a sudden, that bought them for cheaper than they was actually worth. All of a sudden, they're getting like double and triple on their return for it. Becoming very rich. This would upset the original bondholders. Like, hey, what can I do? Essentially, Washington and the federal government is like, hey, you sold your bonds on your own free will. That's not our fault. Tough luck. Sorry. So that makes some folks a lot of kind of mad. That would bring us into Alexander Hamilton. So let's talk about him for a moment. He would establish the National Bank. Now, what is the National Bank? Oh, I lost my quote here. So the National Bank, essentially, it's like a savings account for the federal government. So if the government ever needs money, it can go to the National Bank and borrow it. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have had my page ready here. Yada, 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 Whiskey Rebellion. Nope. Talk about Whiskey Rebellion tomorrow. So the National Bank. So the purpose of the National Bank is, in case we go to war again, we don't have to start taxing and issuing bonds to get money. We'll already have a money supply to help fund a war or fund national emergencies in case like there's a hurricane, tornado, or something that needs the infrastructure needs redoing. The National Bank's there to help with those funds. It's just like a savings account. The U.S. government needs money, they'll go to their savings account, pull some out, and spend it on whatever it needs. A lot of folks disapproved of this because they didn't think the government had the right to create a national bank because it wasn't expressly laid out in the U.S. Constitution. This is something we like to call implied power. It's kind of like implied. It's like when you get your driver's license. It's implied that you're going to follow the law when you're driving. You're not going to speed or you're not going to text, so on and so forth. It's kind of understood that's what's going to happen. Here's what Mr. Alexander Hamilton had to say about the National Bank. Congress' power to create a national bank has a relation more or less direct to the power of collecting taxes, to that borrowing money, to that of regulating trade between the states and those raising and maintaining fleets and armies. A bank has a direct relation to the power of borrowing money because it is an essential instrument in obtaining loans to the government. If a nation is threatened with war, large sums of money are wanted on a sudden to make a requisite preparations. Taxes are laid out with the purpose, but it requires time to obtain the benefit of them. Anticipation is indispensable. If there's a bank, the supply can all be had at once. So essentially, we don't have to rely on taxes. It takes a while to collect taxes and start funding. We already have pretty much a bank account. It's good. George Washington agreed with him. It's like, all right, we can create a national bank. This will be a big issue, especially when we talk about my favorite president, Andrew Jackson, baby. Woo! But Andrew Jackson, he's going to pop the bank. But we'll talk about that later. Whether the bank's constitutional or not. Some say yes, some say no. A lot of folks feared the national bank because they're kind of scared that the rich, they're going to take over and they'll pretty much control the money supply. If you control the money supply, you pretty much can dictate how people live their lives. You kind of see that today. I don't know about y'all, but I've never seen that poor congressman or a poor senator, anything of that sort. It's essentially going to keep the rich in power. That's what a lot of folks thought. That's why they were scared of the national bank. Now, let's talk about one last thing in today's lesson. Let's talk about tariffs. Hopefully. So another way Mr. Hamilton decided to help raise money in the United States is to pass tariffs. So what is a tariff? So, the example I have on the board. Let's pretend these are towels. It costs $4 to make a towel in the United States. But it also costs $4 to make one in Britain. And these are better quality. So essentially you'd have people buying British goods. Whoa, what to my... You'd have people buying British goods over American goods. If you're buying British goods over American goods, the American companies that are producing these, they're not going to make money. Hence, people are not going to have jobs. People start going on unemployment. People get poor, lose yada, 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 so on and so forth. So, a tariff. It's pretty much a tax. Anything that comes overseas to America, it gets taxed. So 25% in this case. So all of a sudden that $4 towel is going to cost $5. Now people are always cheap. They're always going to favor the cheap things. So all of a sudden you have people buying $4 towels instead of $5. This will help the American businesses increase in their employment. People start making money. But this would also make the South angry. Here's a quick another distinction between the North and the South. The Northern economy is heavily based on industry, like they use machines, textiles, you name it, to make their money. While the South, down in here, they rely on agriculture or farming. They're an agrarian economy, and a lot of that economy is based on slave labor. So they don't have these machines, they don't have these products. They have to rely on these cheap goods from Britain. But with this tariff, all of a sudden, everything they're buying increases. They're upset about this. It's like, why are you passing these tariffs? You're favoring the middle New England colonies, or the middle and New England states at this point. Pardon my misspeak. But this will make the South mad. It's like, why are you passing this tariffs? Now all of a sudden we have to pay more for stuff. But as a whole, this would help American industry. These industries start making money, they can start expanding. With that expansion, they can start hiring more people. When you hire more people, they can make more money. When they make more money, they can spend it on American goods, so on and so forth. That's kind of the idea of capitalism. You want to support your own country. But this will make the South angry again. Can't tell, the South, they're kind of sensitive. Southerners get sensitive on a lot of things. If it's something that don't go their way, they're going to get upset. But that's pretty much today's lesson. You have Washington taking office, 1789. He will establish his cabinet. His cabinet, once again, John Adams is named his vice president. Let's see if I got my picture up here. Where is he at? He's not in here. John Adams will become vice president, and you have Henry Knox, Secretary of War. Alexander Hamilton, he's going to be a big political figure for the next part of this class. Secretary of Treasury, pretty much in charge of the nation's money. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, he's in charge of dealing with other nations, setting up trade, treaties, things of that sort. Then you got Edmund Randolph, he's pretty much the people's lawyer. He's making sure everything these folks talk about does not hurt the citizen one way or another. We talked about the Judiciary Act. The Judiciary Act pretty much gives the Supreme Court authorization to overrule state laws if they find them unfair or unconstitutional. Oh, lost my mouse. The Bill of Rights also passed under him. Remember, there was 12 amendments proposed. Only 10 of them got passed. Remember, the first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. 27 amendments altogether today, but the first 10 referred to as the Bill of Rights. Then we have Alexander Hamilton. He sets up the National Bank. Pretty much the National Bank is pretty much a savings account for the federal government, so they can use that money to help pay off like war debts, things of that sort. Pay off the country's debts. A lot of folks found this controversial though, because they didn't think the government had the authorization to establish a national bank, because it wasn't expressly laid out in the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton argued that it does. It's just implied. Kind of like with your driver's license. It's implied that you're going to follow the speed limit. It's implied that you're not going to text and drive. It's implied that you're not going to drive on the wrong side of the road. It's kind of understood. Same thing with this. Washington would agree with Hamilton's reasons. It's like, yeah, it's good if we had a bank account for emergencies. The example he uses, yeah, if we have to raise taxes, yeah, it's good, but nobody likes it when you raise taxes, because nobody likes the government taking their money. I don't know anybody that does. But yeah, take their money, so on and so forth. It takes a while to collect these taxes. So he sets up the National Bank. This will be very controversial when it comes up for a new charter under Jackson. Woo! Love Jackson. You either love or hate Jackson. But the National Bank will be a controversial topic for probably the next 50 years or so. Then we have the passing of the tariffs. Once again, the South will get mad because they don't have industry down in the South. They rely on farming, unlike these middle and New England states. Their economy is based on industry. So pretty much these folks are starting to make money up north, while the South's having to pay more money. Remember, the South's already upset that they're having to help pay off the national debt because the South wasn't really affected that much in the American Revolution as much as New England. Because remember, areas like Boston, they took King George, while typically the South, they could care less. America, Britain, who cares? Just leave us alone. Until Britain threatened them, that's when they jumped into the war. But yes, the South would get upset, especially over the debt issue. So to help keep the Southerners happy, they moved the capital closer to the South, and that's where it's at today, Washington, D.C. It was up in Philadelphia, and now it's down in Washington, D.C. The reason why that typically wherever the capital is kind of a money-making hub. It's like a tourist attraction, so on and so forth. So the Southerners are like, okay, whatever. Then, but the South gets mad again because of these tariffs, because now the Southerners are having to pay more for products that they usually buy. The South, they're sensitive. Best way to put it. Don't mess with their way of life. Still kind of like that today, but I digress. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the end of George Washington's presidency and how he viewed political parties, whether political parties is a good or bad thing for the country. If you don't know what a political party is, perfect example, I'm sure if you've watched any TV this year at all, I'm sure you've seen something about Donald Trump and the Republicans and Joe Biden and the Democrats. That's what I'm referring to when I'm talking about political parties. Washington had his viewpoints on that, whether that's a good or bad thing to have political parties to start with. We'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. We talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. Once again, another rebellion, very similar to Bacon's Rebellion, but we'll talk about that. But till next time, I've been Mr. Phillips. This has been History by Phillips. Make sure you're getting on the Google Classroom. Make sure you're getting on your Ed Mental. I'm about to put the Ed Mental assignments up. And come to study block today at 1:30. But until next time, I'll see y'all. Take care and peace.